Hello, advanced social psychology students. So this is Unit 3, Module 13, Chapter 12, Competition and Cooperation. And this is the last chapter in your textbook. And many of the social psychology textbooks don't even have this chapter. They take the information that's in this chapter and they tuck it in some of the other chapters, especially the prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping chapter, and some of it in the attraction chapter, liking and loving. They put it in different spots, some of it in the working groups chapter. I kind of like the way your textbook does it, of separating it all out and making its own chapter, but it definitely makes for a less dense chapter. It's kind of a nice way to end the last chapter in the book. The last chapter we'll cover, it's not as difficult or as dense as some of the others, and this video is going to be really short. But that's good because next week is your final exam, which is comprehensive. So I'd love to give you not just next week time to prepare for the exam, but to make sure you've got lots of time to prepare for the exam this week also. Okay, let us call up, or let me call up the PowerPoint slides so we could get started. Okay, so again, the topic here is competition and cooperation. So first we need to define these terms. What do we mean by cooperation? Behavior that occurs when we trust the people or groups with whom we are interacting and we're willing to communicate and share with others. So we're sharing, communicating with other people, working together. That's cooperation. And then competition is an attempt to gain as many of the limited rewards as possible for ourselves. And at the same time, we may work to reduce the likelihood or likelihood of success for the other parties. So with cooperation, we're trying to, it's the behavior that occurs when we're trusting the other people, we're interacting, we want what's best for one another. And there may be some self-sacrifice that goes on in cooperation, but it's not only giving and you get nothing in return at all. And then competition is sort of the opposite of it, where it's really about making sure you get what you want and putting down the other group. And in order to study cooperation and competition, in psychology, we use what are called social dilemmas. They already exist in the real world, but we experimentally create these social dilemmas so we can study these things. And a social dilemma is a situation in which the goals of the individual conflict with the goals of the group. And most of the time when we're studying these, when we set up experimental designs to look at them, we focus on the fixed sum outcome social dilemmas. These are when a gain for one side absolutely means a loss for the other. But in the real world, there are integrative outcomes where a solution can be found that benefits all the parties. Sort of what, like, you've got two people that are arguing and you go, well, maybe this third thing, you can both get what you want, really, and everyone wins kind of thing. But when we're looking at that, it's almost like, I think the examples I think of when I think of integrative outcomes is like a couple, and I don't know why this comes to mind, but like a couple, one wants to go to a beach on vacation in Aruba. And the other one says, no, I want us to do a staycation and just go to the Wichita Mountains here. And they're really in this social dilemma. They disagree. What one wants isn't what the other one wants. You know, what are we going to do? And if you can kind of get to, why do you want to go to Aruba? Well, because I really want to sit on a beach. Well, why do you really want to go to the Wichita Mountains? Because I'm really worried about money, and that's going to cost a lot of money to do that. And so then together they decide that they're going to go to Lake Texoma, where they're on a beach, but it's a lot less expensive. And so there's a solution that benefits everyone. Everyone gets, so that's more of an integrative outcome. But the social dilemmas that we're going to focus on experimentally are more fixed sum outcomes. Okay, let's talk about competition. So there are some negative consequences to competition. So when people are competing for resources, it's very likely that conflict will start to escalate because both people want, or both groups of people want, this valued resource. And so what happens is in order to justify why we should get it, we will do some mental gymnastics so that we believe that we're more deserving of this valued resource. So not only do we think, that we should get it just because we want it, but we start to believe that we deserve it and the other group doesn't. And this conflict of we both can't have it, only one of us can win and one of us has to lose, we start to come up with all these reasons why we should win and all these reasons why the other group should lose. And this can lead to some real negative stereotyping. Think of when we were talking about prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping, we talked about Sheriff's conflict theory, when basically we start to believe our groups are more deserving of these things, and not only us, but our whole group than others. And we start to degrade the out groups and upgrade our in groups. And when this gets really bad, it can lead to hostility and even violence. So you have wars starting because both groups believe they should have access to land, valued resource that's on the land, and both groups believe they're more deserving of it. But we have to be careful because sometimes we can get into competition is bad, competition is bad. But I mean, if you step back, capitalism is founded on competition, and most of us believe in capitalism, at least some form of it. And so we have to remember that there are some positive implications from competition also. Competition can lead to higher standards that can be more motivating and lead to greater achievement. How many of you use competition to get your kids to do things? I know when my daughter was in elementary school, she went, you had to get ready. I laid her clothes out the night before, but I needed her to get ready and not lollygag. And all I had to do with her is go, Patricia, let's have a contest. First person dressed wins. Oh, she'd be flying, putting on her uniform, the bow, the socks, the shoes. She'd come flying into my bedroom. Mom, I won. And we'd all cheer and da-da-da. And she was all dressed. It was great. Now, my son, it did not work. He'd come lollygagging in his pajamas. I go, George, you're not going to win. He'd look at me and go, Mom, look, you're winning. Yay. So for some people, the competition is more motivating than others. I know I'm for good or bad, I'm a competitive person. I think for a lot of my life, I was trying to be less competitive. Now at my age, I'm like, whatever, I'm competitive. That's how I am. And so it's an individual difference we can talk more about, or we will be talking more about it in the lecture. But so sometimes I can motivate myself by doing a competition against myself. I can set a little timer and say if I'm having trouble focusing on reading something, I'm going to see if I can read this in 15 minutes. Set the timer for 15. I know it's going to take longer than 15 minutes, but sometimes that's all I need to get myself more motivated. Now, that kind of competition when you're competing against yourself isn't really what we're talking about here, where there's two groups. But you have to, I think it helps us see how sometimes competition can have real positive things. Competition also can really increase social identity. So this is where sports come in, right? So Cameron University is playing against San Angelo State or something. And if I go to the game, I like the basketball game or whatever, when I show up every time Cameron, gets a basket, I'm cheering, woo, Cameron, woo, Cameron. And I look around, everyone's got on their Cameron t-shirts and yay, yay, yay. And by the time I leave, now either we won or we lost. I mean, it's a competition. Both teams can't win. But even when we lose, this sense that we came together cheering for our team really increased my social identity of seeing myself as a member of the Cameron community and part of a group that's a fun group to belong to, part of the Cameron community group. And so this increase in social identity really has some positive impacts. Now, when I was growing up, and remember, I'm a lot older than most of you, but when I was a kid, we learned all the time, Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution. It was all about competition and survival of the fittest. And I was sort of taught your biology is all about, survival of the fittest. So your nature is that you're a really competitive person. But for you to be a good human being, you need to cooperate more. You need to help people. And so your nature is always fighting your nurture. So, like, my parents did a lot to make sure that we were always really reinforced and rewarded for helping other people. And whenever you did help people, you were praised. And like this was being, in our family, like spiritual and against the nature, because your nature is competitive. And so your nature is competitive, but we can train you to be more cooperative, and cooperation makes for a great society kind of thing. Well, now with the research we know now, that is just wrong. We are wired for cooperation. We have in our nature both competition and cooperation. When we help people, we get a squirt of dopamine that feels really good. Remember, dopamine is that feel-good neurotransmitter. And so we are wired for cooperation just as much, if not more, as we are wired for competition. And so, like, we're not really fighting against ourselves to act in a cooperative way. So here, since we've talked about the consequences of competition, let's talk about some of the consequences of cooperation. So most societies will come up with social norms of morality and social fairness. They'll come up with a way so that in order for us all to live together and live together well, we're going to all agree that this is how we're going to treat one another. And we kind of say, this is fair. Does that make sense? And each culture will have these morality beliefs. So morality beliefs are a set of social norms that describe the principles and ideals, as well as the duties and obligations that we view as appropriate, that we use to judge the actions of others and to guide our own behavior. It's sort of like, well, they're the morality beliefs. They're the rules that we set up of this is what good people do and this is what good people don't do. And we have a thing called social conventional morality. Now, this is very culturally based. So different cultures have different social conventional morality. These are norms that are seen as appropriate within a culture, but do not involve behaviors that relate to doing good or doing harm toward others. Okay. Then there's harm-based morality. That's true in all cultures everywhere. And this is where harming others physically or violating their rights is seen as wrong. And that's all the time, everywhere. So we put these together. And we have these ideals of what it means to cooperate and when we should and how much. And it's really important that the people who are in your group that you're doing business with, if you want to say, that you're communicating with, share your morality beliefs. Imagine if one culture thinks that you win, so to speak, or it's morally okay to get the highest price. And they're bargaining with another group that believes that people should only take what they need. And everyone trusts that everyone won't take more than what they need. But that group that has the morality beliefs of you only take what you need, then is trying to go into business with or communicate with or start living near or with a group of people where everyone tries to get the most they can for one another. You can see how that's going to be a disaster because they don't share those morality beliefs. So when groups do live together and people live together, they come up with a set of social norms that they all do agree upon, these morality beliefs that make it much easier for people to cooperate. These social norms of morality and social fairness, we have these norms of what it means to what we believe about what it looks like to treat people fairly. And remember, fairly does not mean equally necessarily. So it may be fair, in fact, that I get more than you because I think I'm more deserving than you. So, or you think that you're more deserving than me. So in your mind, it's fair if you get more than I get. So fairness and equality are not the same thing, okay? Distributive fairness is more like the the rules that we set up. It's our judgments about whether or not a party is receiving a fair share of the available rewards. Where procedural fairness is more about the procedures. So it's almost like when I always think of policies and procedures, distributed fairness is sort of like the policy, and then procedural fairness is the procedure we use so that the policy is followed. Procedural fairness is the beliefs about the fairness of the procedures used to distribute the available rewards among the parties. Does that make sense? So let's say, this isn't a really good example, but it gets us a point. Let's say you appeal your grade. You think in a class you took last semester, you weren't fairly graded, so you appeal your grade. Distributed fairness is about whether or not you think the instructor gave you a fair grade and you don't think they did. That's why you're appealing the grade. The procedural fairness was the procedure that you were able to follow to appeal the grade fair? So not was the grade fair, that's distributed fairness, but now are you able to argue it in a fair way? That's the procedural fairness. Does that kind of make sense? Then your book goes on to talk about false consciousness. And I will say, I had never heard that term before. Or if I have, I don't remember it. The concept I've heard of before, but I wouldn't put too much investment in that, in the name of that, because I mean, I've been studying social psychology for like 30 years and I'd never heard of that term. So this is false consciousness, is when you accept your own low status as part of the proper and normal functioning of society. When I have heard it talked about, I've always heard about it as the people internalize the hierarchy that the group gives them. And so what false consciousness is, according to your textbook, or at least according to this definition, is each group will come up with a hierarchy of, who's deserving of what. That's the distributive fairness. And so some people are supposed to get a lot more status, a lot more of the rewards, a lot more of the resources than others in the group. So you've got low status members and high status members. And to be fair, the low status members are supposed to get less than the high status members. And people who are members of the low status group or subgroup, you might think they're going to be arguing to get the rules all changed, to get the hierarchy to change. But oftentimes they won't. Oftentimes they're some of the biggest loudest voices to keep the hierarchy alive, because they've internalized that this hierarchy is appropriate. Now we know why the people who are higher in the hierarchy are proponents of keeping the hierarchy as is and think it's great because they're winning. But how about the people who are in the low status part of the hierarchy? Shouldn't they want to change the hierarchy and overthrow it because they're getting ripped off? But oftentimes, no, they're fighting to keep the hierarchy in place as much as anyone else because they've internalized that that's the right place for them to be. Social creativity is the use of strategies that allow members of low status groups to perceive their groups as better than other groups. So this low status group members in a group, right? What they can do is sort of create their own subgroup and then sort of feel like their subgroup is really awesome and better than the subgroup that's got lots of power or higher status in the group. Does that make sense? Your book uses the example of, Black is beautiful at a time when African Americans may have seen themselves as very low status. Well, then they go, no, to be Black is to be beautiful. Another example, this one isn't in your text, but some of the subgroups will come up with, they'll use what used to be a negative term to describe them. They'll start calling themselves that to take the sting out of that word or out of the name that was meant to hurt them. So I think there was a group of prostitutes and they'd call them like whores are us or something. And they used whore very positively and pride, with lots of pride. And the idea is look, I'm proud to be a whore. It's my body. I can do what I want. I'm making a lot of money. Beats doing what you're doing. So this subgroup where being called a whore was seen as a terrible insult and putting them down, they're now calling themselves that. This is social creativity. That's one of the strategies that they're using, is to take the sting out of that name and be proud. I'm a whore. Like, this is a good thing. Okay. And it's a way to see themselves as better than the groups, that the subgroups that have higher status. And then, of course, one thing that's going to happen from time to time, like it almost makes the most common sense that would happen, is collective action where you change the hierarchy. So this is attempts on the part of one group to change the social status hierarchy by improving the status of their own group relative to others. So you can see, like, different groups will go, we should have higher hierarchy. We've got to get rid of thinking that I'm no longer going to be ashamed that I'm part of this subgroup. In fact, my subgroup's better, and we're going to throw out this old hierarchy, and here's a new hierarchy that we're going to use. Okay, so those are all consequences of cooperation, or that's the way that they're talked about in your textbook anyway. Now, I want to talk about social dilemmas. And so social dilemmas, again, are one of the ways that social psychologists study. Well, they exist in the real world, but when we go to study competition and cooperation, when we put people in a social dilemma, we can really see what people are likely to do and the factors that affect cooperation and competition. And there's at least 3 different social dilemmas that are really common that I'd like you to know about. One that we call the public's goods dilemma. And this is that the benefits that are shared by a community at large, that everyone in the group has access to, regardless of whether or not they have personally contributed to the creation of the goods. It's given this name, public goods. Sometimes it's called the commons dilemma, because back in Europe a long time ago, each city would have like this common area, and it was agriculture, right? And so if you could get your cows and sheep and horses or whatever to eat on the grass that's on the commons, so there was a common area that each community had. For you, it was to your advantage if your cattle could be eating that grass, because that was less grass that you would then have to find and feed your cattle, right? But if everyone puts their cattle on the commons, then the cattle are going to eat it all the way down to the ground, and then no more grass will grow, and access to the commons will go away from everyone, for everyone. No one will be able to use it. Okay. So public goods it's an individual will win if they use as much of it as they can. But if everyone uses as much of it as it can, then it will go away completely, and then no one can use it at all. So in a public goods situation, it would be really helpful if the community set up rules. We go back to these cooperation rules. If they come up with social norms of morality, if they come up with procedures of distributed fairness, how many sheep or how many cattle can each person put on there? And if you're higher status in the group, like let's say you're a doctor, so maybe you get to put more of your cattle on there because you've less time to actually tend the sheep and tend your farm, because you're helping people with their medical issues. So the community can come up with ways to take care of the public goods dilemma. And it's a dilemma because, again, the advantage to the individual, if every individual does that, then the whole thing goes away, becomes a disadvantage to the whole group. Another dilemma that's common is the contributions dilemma, when the short-term costs of a behavior leave individuals to avoid performing it. But if no one performs it, no one performs it, no one performs it, then eventually you don't get the long-term benefits that would have occurred if we had been performing it. So let's look at like donating money to public TV. If no one gives money to public TV, if no one gives money to public TV, if no one, then eventually the public TV doesn't exist. It goes away, it doesn't exist, and no one benefits from it. But in the short term, when you're giving money to it, you're sort of losing. But in the long term, everyone wins. So again, how are we going to make this work? We want to come up with really good social norms of morality and social fairness so that people who have more are donating more money to public TV. People who have less donate less. But it's fair, not equal, but fair so that we all get to use this. And then a really common dilemma. So if you do like meta-analyses and you look at research in this area, there's quite a bit on public goods, there's quite a bit on contributions dilemma, but by far and large, there are more meta-analyses on prisoner's dilemma than anything else. And so with the prisoner's dilemma, what I'd like you to do is just watch this video, but basically, I wonder if you'll be able to see the video. It's got its own, you can either stop this video and play this link on your PowerPoint slides, or it's a separate link that says Prisoner's Dilemma in this chapter. So if you'll stop the video and watch that right now. Okay. Okay, well, welcome back. So hopefully you enjoyed that video. It was real short, like you saw. You could see with the Prisoner's Dilemma, logically, everyone should compete, but we don't always do that, like they said. And so what are some of the variables that end up affecting competition and cooperation? Well, a huge thing is how you set up the problem or the task, the nature of the problem or the task. So for example, in class, like this graduate level class, imagine if I started out and I said, only 10% of you are going to get A's, or 20% of you are going to get A's, and 40% of you are going to get B's, and 20% of you, does that equal 100, are going to get C's. I'm setting up this whole class as though you're competing with one another. And then I should expect you to compete with one another. You might actually do some things where you're not helping other students in the class. You're not helping them to learn. You're not helping them to do well on the exam. But as a science, we're very cooperative. I mean, we build science on the shoulders of the scientists who came before us, right? Everyone's learning off of the research that went before us, and that's why it's so important to know the research that went before you. We want research to be very cooperative. And so if we're teaching a graduate level course, and we're like trying to talk about how psychology is a science, we rely so heavily on the scientific method, shouldn't this be very cooperative? And so it's much better if I start out saying, all of you can get A's. As long as you meet the standard, this whole class can get A's. And in reality, it can. I've had semesters where everyone in advanced social psychology got A's. Now it's kind of harder if you're talking about a general psychology class and there's 40 people in there. If an instructor gives all 40, general psychology students an A, they probably won't be asked to come back and teach at Cameron again. Mainly because I think we all say, there's no way everyone in your class could have done that well. But imagine if you're an instructor teaching general psych, if you start out and you tell the students, I'm only giving this percentage A's and this percentage B's and this percentage C's and this percentage D's and this percentage F's, and you're going to lead to that competition. So you can see the nature of the problem or the task can lead to cooperation versus competition. So we want to be really careful how we set up tasks and problems. Communication, as you saw in the video, is huge. Communication changes almost all of this. You can take a very competitive task, and if you allow people to if you can allow people to communicate, they can come up with rules that make things really fair. And all you need to do is just watch a group of first graders. Do you know what I mean? I have a memory of my daughter in first grade and her friend being playing around the pool, and my daughter kept doing this thing over and over, and her friend said, that's not fair, like I should have a turn also. And my daughter was, yeah, but I want to. And she says, but that's not fair. And she had an older sister, and she said, for it to be fair, you go and then I go, and then you go and then I go. And my daughter's like, oh, that does make sense. So with some communication and some procedures can be created that everyone agrees on, and then they're executed properly, and you can end up with lots of cooperation. And if you don't do that, you don't allow people to communicate, you can end up with a lot more competition, because the communication, if it leads to trust, will lead people to cooperate more. If the communication lets us know we can't trust the other person, it could lead to more competition. Does that make sense? Then there are certain personality characteristics. Certain people just have an individual difference where they are more competitive than others, and other people are more cooperative than others. It's just part of how they're built. I know my son, like from the time he was very young, he was very, very cooperative. My daughter was really great at helping, almost like in a leadership way. If something happened, she'd be there to fix the situation, but she is always very competitive. And you could, and she loved competition. She loved being in sports. She loved, in the end, it was gymnastics and cheerleading that became her thing. But she also liked, all the other sports that we had her in. What was it, like soccer and t-ball and things like that. My son, he loved piano and he loved the singing, the voice recitals, and he loved doing plays. Think about how when you're in a play, there's competition in order to get selected to be in the play. But once you're in the play, doing the play is completely cooperative. And so it fit his personality really well. Gender differences, women are more cooperative than men. I mean, by and large. Why is that? We don't know. Is it something that's inborn because they're going to be moms, or they could be potentially moms, and cooperation, someone who's more cooperative is likely to be a better caretaker of a child, perhaps? We don't know. But in many, many cultures and over time, when we look, women tend to be more cooperative and less competitive than men. And then culture just has a huge impact on it. So, and you can read in the textbook about that. Well, as I said, I was going to try to keep this lecture shorter because there isn't as much in this chapter. I think when you read it, you'll find it interesting, but it's not as dense as some of the other chapters. And also, you've got a lot to do. We'll be discussing an article this week, but also next week is the final exam. Remember how the final exam is comprehensive. It doesn't just cover these 3 chapters. It covers everything, and it's very applied. And if you go to next week's link, you'll get more information about the final exam. All right, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can email me at marydz@cameron.edu. All right, thank you.